Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Terrence Duncan, and I am going to discuss Module 6 of 8 of the Dissertation Journey. The title of this particular module is known as the Selecting the Best Method, and the subtitle is Qualitative versus Quantitative, who will win? As a doctoral candidate, you will be looking to select what is the best method for your particular type of study, and it's basically a battle between who's going to win this particular selection and who's not going to win this selection. The objectives of this particular module includes avoiding bias and selecting study methodology. You also want to recognize the benefits and challenges of qualitative methods as well as the quantitative methods. And you also want to recognize the benefits of mixed methods in research. You may recall from Module 5 of the Dissertation Journey some of the key points. They included how to continue the discussion on the dissertation alignment. We also discussed the finer approach towards developing research questions. You used questions to, you identified questions to consider developing the research questions for your study. And we also discussed avoiding ambiguity and developing the particular research questions. Reducing ambiguity and the methodology selection. So as I stated in prior modules, two things that you'll definitely be working on identifying and trying to mitigate against over and over again is ambiguity and bias. So on this particular slide, we're discussing how the inclusion or the exclusion of a population could affect the results of the study. You want to recognize that the greater the ambiguity, the higher the probability of random errors could occur in the study selection process. As a researcher, you want to try to reduce the bias by conducting systematic reviews of the literature. You may recall the word action research, and this is where it rears its head again. Action research, by doing a systematic review of the literature, will definitely help reduce the bias in your methodology selection. You should also note that the qualitative and the quantitative studies have different techniques to identify and remove bias, and depending on who you or which particular method that you select, it is your responsibility to make sure that you identify and remove bias during the entire process. At this particular point, you have seen the words qualitative and quantitative. I'm pretty sure it's been beaten down in your skull pretty good, but there's so much more to learn about these two methods. But just things to consider for this particular module are the two different types, qualitative, quantitative. Understand the characteristics as you are developing your methodology. This also ties into your purpose statement. Some of the characteristics for the qualitative includes exploring and understanding. On a quantitative side, you're actually going to do an examination of the relationship between variables. So you have explore on the qualitative side, and then you have examine on the quantitative side. On the qualitative side, you also are providing emergent questions. Some of these questions could be derived based on the research or examining the artifacts and developing the research questions, or some of the emergent questions could occur during the actual interview process with your selected participants. Or qualitative, you have an inductive style that focuses on the individual. The quantitative is more robust, and it provides a deductive style of logic. When you think about qualitative and quantitative, the comparisons between the two, qualitative is open-ended, left to interpretation. Quantitative, it builds against bias and generalizes the findings. In Cresswell, they talked about mixed methods, and for most doctoral students, they may have the idea of going through a mixed method particular type of study. As a doctoral chair and a mentor, I actually try to steer students away from mixed methods because of the last point of this particular slide, that it could not be ideal for many doctoral candidates due to its time constraints, financial aid concerns, or the desire to complete. But one thing to do note about mixed methods is that if you do go for a more scholar model, or if you're working on clinical studies, or if you're trying to do some kind of a community grant, based grant, where it may take an extended period of time and time is not a factor in conducting the study, mixed methods could be preferable because of the fact that it marries both methods to provide the optimal results. And it also takes both characteristics of identifying the themes and determining relationships to provide a more robust and accurate results of the study. As a researcher, as noted again with ambiguity, you want to avoid bias. And on a qualitative side, ways to avoid or mitigate against bias is to try to use multiple people to decode the data. You want to verify with more data sources, and you want to assess for alternative explanations, meaning that you don't want to just have a solo practitioner approach towards using qualitative because of the fact that, inherently everybody has some form of bias, but by having other people to look at the information, it would help, provide to decode the data in a way that you may miss, or say, hey, you may be looking at this data one particular way, but according to the research, this more aligns with what this particular authors are saying. On the quantitative side, ways to mitigate against bias is that you want to use a neutral tone in developing research questions. So you don't want to use gender-based questions or leading questions. You want to have something that's very black and white in general as far as the questions, but you want it to be very clear and very concise in the wording. Also, ways to mitigate against bias in quantitative studies is that you understand systematic errors in the research. So as you are doing the data analysis, you want to try to guard yourself against bias. There's different ways, different methods, and on both sides, they all have multiple methods within the major method. We're not going to go over that, but that's just something that you want to understand on a quantitative side. Also, on a quantitative survey, you may notice, or you may be curious as to why Likert scales are normally 5 or 7 points, or 5 or 7 points on a scale. A lot of that involves the fact that you don't want to just have a yes or no, agree or disagree in your research questions, because the research says that after a while, you're going to lean 70% towards a agree without really providing much thought or insight into the question. Selecting a method. You want to select a method that's best for your particular research proposal, and you want to kind of look at on both sides of the fence. So I know that I was speaking with somebody the other day. She was asking about, this particular method that she could consider for her particular study, and she had mentioned that it was funny that in the beginning, when anything was quantitative, she would look at it and she would not try to assess it. She would not try to understand what the t-test, the ANOVA, whether it's statistically significant or not. That's found on most of the research that involves data analysis. And now she feels a little bit more comfortable reading it. And now she's actually leaning towards using a quantitative study where she started off with qualitative. I usually see that a lot with students under my mentorship, or students that actually coach for their dissertation, that they lean more towards qualitative studies, and they just would prefer to ask the questions without really understanding how qualitative studies really work. So when you want to select a method, you want to find something that actually aligns well with what you are trying to study, not with your personal preference, because the personal preference does create the form of bias that you're trying to avoid in developing a research methodology. Some of the other reasons why students may be concerned about quantitative studies is because of the lack of repetition or experience may heighten their reservations towards that particular style of study. But in 2020 and beyond, there's so many different resources available for students to look at, to explore, to be able to help them to understand how to conduct basic quantitative studies. And as you are working on your research proposals, and if you are thinking about leaning towards the quantitative studies, there are several types of quantitative studies where it may not involve much manipulation of the variables or conducting numerous tests. You find a quantitative methodology that you may feel comfortable with, but also that aligns well with your study. Overall, candidates should select the best methodological approach based on the actual research. So what does the research say? It all goes back to developing your problem statement, your purpose statement, and now here we are on the methodology selection. What does the research say? Why is this particular method more prominent in this particular scope of the research that you're considering on doing? Continuing to do the systematic literature review can also assist mapping and reassessing. Under qualitative research, we talked about the characteristics of induction versus deduction. Something to note is that observations leading to generalizations versus theories predicting outcomes. So you want to be able to see what the bigger picture is, and then you want to try to understand a little bit more why this is the way that it is. Becker had, in a book in 1963, Becker had noted in an interview question, which is somewhat relevant, in this day and age where you're seeing a lot more push for a decriminalization of marijuana. But he wrote this in 1963. How does one become a marijuana user? That is actually an interview question that was used, and actually is one of the foundational questions where a lot of additional research was related to qualitative studies. So Becker, 1963, look it up. I have the reference at the end of the slide. It definitely provides a lot of good information for those who may be a little bit more curious on using the qualitative method of study. You also want to note the definition of the concept range as follows. It could be vague, and that it may include different views, and it could be confusing as it means different things to different people. So qualitative, and it pretty much mirrors a lot of the characteristics of qualitative versus quantitative, where quantitative is pretty much black and white, straightforward. Qualitative, you're going to have multiple colors. It's going to have different shades of gray, and it's not going to be as straight as a line as you would see under quantitative research. Before you make your research selection under the qualitative methodology, you want to consider the advantages and the disadvantages of the qualitative research. And I'm not going to go through each one, but some of the advantages includes achieving a deeper insight and understanding the human experiences more intuitively. And some of the disadvantages you want to consider is that if you're doing something that might have some form of social impact change, you may want to understand that, you may want to note that policymakers may give low credibility for qualitative studies. They would prefer to see the hard data. So that's just something to consider, not only just for your particular research proposal for your dissertation, but also for additional research that you may do outside of the university. The other disadvantage for qualitative research selection could include the data interpretation and analysis could still be more difficult, and it could lead to errors in the interpretation. Quantitative research, very black and white, very data driven. Some of the key characteristics, again, is that it denotes amounting something. So there's, why is the sky blue? The sky is blue because of X, Y, Z, and it's usually supported by hypothesis, is conducted by the research, and it's either validated, either it is or it's not, based on whatever the research tells you. Deductive logic and positivism underpins the research, as well as examines the hard logic and relationship between the variables. Similar to the qualitative research selection, you should be mindful of the quantitative research selection and advantages and the disadvantages that it entails. Again, I'm not going to read the entire slide, but some of the key points to note is that it provides objectivity and accuracy and relatively straightforward results. So remember what I say, straight line, black and white, removes a lot of ambiguity and removes a lot of bias. Some of the disadvantages includes that it does not ascertain deeper meanings and reflections. That's where you see it on the qualitative side, and it provides a snapshot of the phenomenon. So it doesn't get a chance to get emergent questions that come from the quantitative study, unlike the qualitative study. And that's where I go back to the mixed methods, why that is a preferred method for, if you have the time to do it, you're able to get more answers and you can understand what is in the black and white, what makes the shades of gray and the colors, what makes it all connect and provide the answers that you seek. Ultimately, when you decide to make the selection, who wins, it just comes down to 4 key points. It starts off with the action research. What does the action research tell you that's related to your study? You should, even though that you may be considering doing something relatively new, there is research connected somewhere along the way that still addresses that particular problem. So make sure you do the action research, and also make sure you do a systematic review. Don't look at 1 or 2 articles. You may need to look at 7, 8, or 9, or 10, depending on the type of study that you're trying to propose. And you may not use that in your literature review, but reviewing more outside of what you tend to put into your dissertation will help expand knowledge. It'll improve your knowledge base and actually answer some of the questions that you seek. And you may actually identify additional gaps in the literature or realize that your study may not provide any response to the gap of the literature as identified in prior reviews. Third, you want to map the type of research central to the proposed study. I recall when I was working on my dissertation, I had color-coded my research on qualitative and quantitative, and I had up to 10 articles, and I just, based on my particular subject, and I literally went through the methodology section and found out what was the central themes, the constructs. I eventually went to a quantitative. I started off with qualitative, but I decided, I wanted to provide some kind of a data analysis that was relative and provided a concrete response to that particular snapshot. And so the research helped guided me, saying that it was preferable to do a quantitative study versus qualitative. And the last thing you want to consider, does the research questions match to your scope of study? It all comes down to the alignment. It starts off with the introduction, the background, your problem statement. It comes down to your purpose statement. Is your problem statement addresses the problem within the last 5 years, and how does it relate to general business practice? And also, does your research questions match to the particular methodology that you prefer to select? So some of the challenges that I have seen with students in the past is that they provide qualitative questions, research questions for a quantitative study and vice versa. So make sure your research questions align with everything else in your study. And that concludes our module 6, and the next module will be posted up shortly. And if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email.